Jealousy doesn't just appear out of nowhere, it is cultivated. For two of the most powerful and elegant women of the 20th century, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis and her younger sister Lee Radziwill, the seeds of rivalry were planted in their very own home. As they grew older, the competition went further than anyone could have imagined. The older sister walked away with the younger sister's billionaire lover, and the younger sister quietly crossed the line with her sister's husband, the President of the United States. This rivalry didn't stop at men or social standing. It lasted until death parted them. Why would two women born into silk and immense privilege spend their entire lives tearing apart their own blood ties? Join me as we uncover the deep roots of the trauma and dysfunction that shaped the complicated love between Jackie and Lee. The Seeds on Park Avenue, how the Bouvier family created two rivals. In the New York high society of the 1930s, the Bouvier family on Park Avenue looked like a flawless picture of wealth. But behind the heavy wooden doors and damask-covered walls, Jacqueline and Caroline Lee Bouvier were raised according to a ruthless casting system. Their father, John Vernou Bouvier III, a charming stockbroker known as Black Jack, chose a winner early on. He saw his firstborn daughter, Jackie, born in 1929, as his personal masterpiece. Black Jack even coined a family term called vitamin P, standing for praise. But this vitamin wasn't distributed equally. He openly poured his most passionate compliments onto Jackie right in front of her younger sister. He called Jackie a genius, an extraordinary creature, and a girl whose intellect and beauty far exceeded ordinary standards. Jackie absorbed this praise and naturally grew up believing she was born to be admired. Lee, born 4 years later, received a softer but inherently lesser affection. She was taught that she was a good child, sweet and pretty. These were the gentle adjectives reserved for a supporting character. In her young mind, Lee quickly understood the harsh hierarchy of their household. Her father's love was a limited resource, and Jackie had already claimed the vast majority of it. If their father handed out the roles, their mother, Janet Lee Bouvier, set the rules of the game. Janet came from a family with plenty of real estate wealth but lacked deep old money roots. This made her feel constantly scrutinized by the traditional Protestant elite. To compensate for her insecurity, Janet saw her daughters as her only strategic assets to elevate the family's standing. She disciplined Jackie and Lee with an iron will. The sisters were forced to master equestrian show jumping, speak Parisian French, and attend rigorous lessons in taste and etiquette. Janet monitored every inch of her daughters' appearances. She taught them that marriage was not an emotional safe haven but a lever for social mobility. The comparisons were daily. They were judged on who rode with more grace, who caught the eyes of the young barons, and who had the more flawless posture. Looking at this through the lens of psychology, Jackie, the eldest, faced the primal fear of being dethroned when her sister arrived. This fear drove her to become highly controlling, always seeking perfection and power to ensure her top position was never threatened. Lee, on the other hand, carried the inferiority complex of the second child. She constantly tried to make up for her disadvantages through controlled rebellion, chasing titles and attention that were out of her sister's reach. Both developed deep insecurities stemming from their parents' bitter and scandalous divorce in 1940. Their father's constant affairs and their mother's cold calculation stripped away their inner sense of safety. They learned early on that people betray and love fades. Only money, status, and legally bound prestige were reliable lifelines. Jackie was molded into the golden child, carrying all the expectations and the spotlight. Lee became the invisible child, existing simply as a backdrop to her sister's brilliance. This damaging blueprint planted a simple but dangerous seed in their young minds. A sister is not an ally. She is a competitor for survival in a world where there is only one throne. The shared blueprint, marriage as a weapon. As they entered adulthood, both Jacqueline and Lee carried the blueprint of marriage their mother had etched into their minds. They weren't looking for soulmates. They were looking for playing pieces on a chessboard of status. But because they started from different psychological places, their strategies soon went in opposite directions. In April 1953, a 20-year-old Lee Bouvier rushed down the aisle with Michael Canfield, the adopted son of a prominent New York publisher. As Lee herself would later admit, this first marriage did not come from love. It was a desperate attempt to unlock a door and escape her mother's suffocating control and the gloomy atmosphere of the family estate. However, Lee's short-lived victory was quickly overshadowed. Just 5 months later, in September 1953, Jackie married John F. Kennedy, a wealthy young senator and a rising star in American politics. Jackie's wedding in Newport became the social event of the decade. It was attended by over 1,000 elite guests with a massive press corps covering every single detail. Lee's wedding from 5 months prior was completely buried in history. Lee's disappointment turned into a personal struggle when her life in London with Michael Canfield revealed its true nature. Canfield was struggling with heavy drinking and was consumed by doubts about his true parentage. He was slowly losing his grip on his life. Lee once recalled a moment that perfectly captured the collapse of their marriage. Returning to their Chester Square home one afternoon, she couldn't open the front door because her husband was lying unconscious right behind it. While Jackie was walking alongside JFK on the path to the White House, becoming a national symbol of fashion and power, a 25-year-old Lee was trying to figure out how to pull an alcoholic husband off the floor. But the race didn't allow Lee to pause. In 1959, after finalizing her divorce from Canfield, Lee launched her countermove. She married Stanislaw Albrecht Radziwill, an exiled Polish aristocrat 14 years her senior. He carried the blood of Grand Dukes dating back to the 16th century. Even though the Radziwill family had lost their lands and estates in Eastern Europe after the Second World War, Stanislaw's title of prince was still a gleaming piece of armor that allowed Lee to adopt a new name. She was now Princess Lee Radziwill. If Jackie was about to become the first lady of the most powerful nation in the world, Lee had turned herself into European royalty. In London, Lee transformed their Buckingham Place home into a sanctuary of luxury. It became a gathering place for the highest ranks of nobility, artists, and politicians. Yet behind the walls, covered in expensive Indian paisley fabric, the marriage with Prince Radziwill was growing cold. He was an older man in poor health, carrying the aloofness of the old aristocracy. He admired Lee's beauty but failed to see the real woman inside. Both sisters had achieved what they were looking for on the surface. They had status, fame, titles, and the world's attention, but they didn't realize they were running their lives on the energy of their rivalry. They didn't choose men who made them happy. They chose men who could make the other sister feel inferior. Their mother's marriage blueprint worked perfectly for social climbing, but it left two young women sitting entirely alone inside their gilded cages. The climax of the race, Onassis and the unhealed wound. In the early 1960s, the silent competition between the sisters reached a boiling point when a shared prize appeared on the horizon. His name was Aristotle Onassis, the Greek shipping billionaire. Onassis didn't just represent a vast fortune that dwarfed the standards of New York high society. He represented raw, absolute power. He was a man who needed no social validation because he could simply buy it. Lee Radziwill was the first to step into his world. They met in 1958, and by 1961, as her marriage to Prince Radziwill was fracturing, Lee and Onassis entered into a deeply private but intense relationship. Onassis was captivated by Lee's delicate beauty, her exquisite taste, and her aristocratic title. In return, Lee found protection and endless financial resources in a man 27 years her senior. This wealth could offer her total independence, freeing her from relying on anyone else. Onassis gave Lee quiet promises of a future together, a marriage that would place her at the very peak of international society. Everything changed in the summer of 1963. After the tragic loss of her infant son, Patrick, First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy fell into a deep depression. Out of genuine sisterly compassion, Lee arranged a restorative trip for Jackie. She invited her sister aboard the Christina O, the ultra-luxury yacht owned by Onassis, for a retreat on the Aegean Sea. It was a decision that would reshape the destinies of all three. The moment Jackie stepped onto the Christina O, the hierarchy was upended. Onassis, a man always hunting for the world's ultimate symbols of power, quickly realized that Lee was merely an exiled princess, while Jackie was the sun the whole planet revolved around. The preferential treatment began right there on the deck. Onassis gave Lee expensive gifts, but he presented Jackie with a museum-quality necklace of diamonds and rubies, along with a level of devotion that bordered on subservience. Lee watched it all from the corner of the room. She felt the exact sensation of being dethroned that she had known since childhood, now playing out with cruel repetition. In November 1963, JFK was assassinated in Dallas. Jackie became the most famous widow in modern history. For the next 5 years, as Jackie struggled to escape the controlling glass cage of the Kennedy family and the relentless press, Onassis waited patiently on the edges of her life. The relationship between Lee and Onassis was pushed into the shadows, turning into a promise postponed indefinitely. The final blow came in October 1968. Onassis called Lee with a brief message before the news exploded across global headlines. He was marrying Jacqueline Kennedy on the island of Scorpios. Those who knew her say that upon hearing the news, Lee froze for a few seconds. Then, using the composure she had been taught since childhood like a suit of armor to protect her last shred of dignity, she sent a brief telegram of congratulations. She even attended the wedding on Scorpios. In the historic photos from that day, Lee can be seen walking behind her sister wearing a forced smile that the press later called the most exquisite moment of endurance in high society. Onassis didn't marry Jackie for pure romance. To the Greek billionaire, Lee was a high-end jewel, but Jackie was the crown that transformed him from a rough, newly rich tycoon into a historical figure. The only woman Onassis was truly emotionally attached to until his dying day was the opera singer Maria Callas. He continuously went back to Callas even after marrying Jackie. Jackie married Onassis for total financial protection and security for her children. and Lee was left behind, bitterly realizing that the most valuable resource she had ever found was once again snatched away by the golden child. The Onassis wound was the most brutal proof that the race set up by their parents had burned away their ability to love each other purely. Blood was no longer a safe harbor. It was a battlefield. The friend who knew too much, Truman Capote, and the price of trust. The pain of watching her sister take her lover, combined with the dead end of her marriage to Prince Radziwill, left Lee in a state of emotional emptiness. In the cold world of high society, where any display of weakness was seen as a strategic failure, Lee looked for a place to take off her mask. She found it in Truman Capote. In the early 1960s, Capote was at the height of his literary and social power following the massive success of In Cold Blood. Unique, sharp-witted, and possessing a distinct Southern drawl, Capote surrounded himself with the most beautiful, wealthy, and powerful women of New York. He affectionately called them his swans. Among women like Babe Paley, Slim Keith, and CZ Guest, Lee Radziwill held a very special place. Capote saw something in Lee that others missed. He saw a sharp but deeply wounded soul, a woman who always felt like the second choice. They became inseparable confidants. They spent hours on the phone in the middle of the night and traveled together through European capitals. Capote gave Lee the one thing she craved most. He gave her independent validation, styling advice, and unspoken permission to desire things beyond her social confines. During those intimate conversations, Lee poured out her most closely guarded secrets. She shared her bitterness toward Jackie, her disappointments in marriage, hidden financial struggles, and a burning desire to make a name for herself. Capote listened with the empathy of a true soulmate. But Lee forgot one fundamental truth. Capote was a writer first and foremost, and to a writer with Capote's predatory instincts, high society pain was merely material. In 1975, Esquire magazine published a chapter titled La Côte Basque, 1965. It was an excerpt from Capote's unfinished novel, Answered Prayers. The book was promoted as a brutally realistic masterpiece that would tear the masks off New York's elite without mercy. When the magazine hit the stands, a shockwave tore through high society. Beneath a clumsy layer of fiction, the character of Lady Ina Coolberth was unmistakably Lee Radziwill. In the pages, Capote exposed her most private conversations about sleeping with powerful men, her bitter remarks about her sister Jackie Lee's own brief and failed acting career, and the petty fractures inside grand estates. Capote's betrayal was a direct strike to Lee's deepest wound. The only person she had trusted with the keys to her inner world had used those very secrets to turn her into cheap entertainment for the public. The reaction from society was swift and unforgiving. Babe Paley, who was dying of cancer, cut Capote out of her life instantly. Slim Keith, CZ Guest, and Lee Radziwill orchestrated a complete and total social exile. Truman Capote, the man who had once been the center of every elite dinner party, became an outcast. He was entirely banished from the world he had spent his life climbing into. In 1984, Capote died at the age of 60. He succumbed to liver failure from severe alcohol and drug abuse, completely alone. When asked about his passing, Lee responded with a brief, carefully calculated sentence. She said he was an incredibly talented man and she was very sorry for his tragic end. She didn't mention a single word about the book offering no public forgiveness. The race with Jackie had kept Lee constantly searching for outside validation, making her an easy target for exploitation by someone like Capote. This betrayal taught Lee one final bitter lesson about the upper class. Privacy is the only asset you cannot afford to lose, and a secret once spoken out loud becomes the most dangerous currency of all. The illusion of freedom and the cost of perfection. Following the disaster with Truman Capote and her official divorce from Prince Radziwill in 1974, Lee entered her 40s facing an uncomfortable financial reality. Behind the image of a princess living in million-dollar apartments in London and New York was a truth the elite tried hard to hide. Lee did not have massive self-generating wealth. She relied on divorce settlements, family assistance, and the generosity of rich friends. The need to escape Jackie's shadow, combined with the pressure to maintain a lavish lifestyle, pushed Lee to build her own career. It was an effort to prove she could create value on her own without leaning on a title or a man. In 1976, at the age of 43, she launched an interior design firm, Lee Radziwill Inc., operating right out of her duplex on the Upper East Side. Unlike other society ladies who treated careers as hobbies, Lee brought a natural, refined taste that had been honed over decades. Her collaborations with the legendary Italian designer Renzo Mongiardino at her Buckingham Place home in London and the Turville Grange estate in Oxfordshire created some of the most iconic living spaces of the 20th century. Lee further cemented her place in the fashion world by taking on the role of director of special events for Giorgio Armani from 1985 to 1994. Armani called her an ambassador of style, a woman who expressed elegance not by piling things on but through the art of reduction. Interestingly, it was Lee who initiated and funded the early stages of a documentary project by the Maysles brothers in 1971. She wanted a film about her childhood in East Hampton. Scouting trips led them to the decaying Grey Gardens estate where her aunt Edith Bouvier Beale, known as Big Edie, and her cousin Little Edie were living in squalor alongside dozens of cats and piles of garbage. The project quickly pivoted into the legendary 1975 documentary Grey Gardens, now considered a cinematic masterpiece. However, once the film was finished, Lee demanded her name be removed from the credits and tried to confiscate the original footage. Her instinct to protect the flawless old money image of the Bouvier family, a psychological inheritance from her mother, overpowered any artistic inspiration. Lee simply could not allow the world to see the decay behind the family walls. Her career and artistic pursuits gave Lee a surface-level independence, but underneath the endless race continued. In 1988, Lee married for the third time. Her new husband was Herbert Ross, a highly successful Hollywood film director. Whispers in society suggested this marriage carried Lee's ambition to conquer the Los Angeles film world, a territory Jackie had never touched. But just like the times before, the marriage ended in coldness. They divorced in 2001, shortly before Ross passed away. During these years, Lee established a strict unspoken rule with all her closest friends, including the famous fashion editor Andre Leon Talley. The name Jacqueline Kennedy was never to be mentioned in her presence. Lee created an aesthetically perfect world. Her apartment on East 72nd Street in New York was decorated with a refined minimalism embodying Diana Vreeland's famous motto that elegance is refusal. But that perfection was just another glass cage. Lee refused excess clutter, she refused unsafe relationships, and she refused the reality that she was still living her life in reaction to her sister. Her independence at its core was still a chain reaction started by a childhood race. The final price: loss, wills, and solitude. Time has a cruel way of settling the score when it comes to the pursuit of vanity. When the glow of the parties finally faded, the true price Lee Radziwill and Jacqueline Kennedy paid for a lifetime of rivalry wasn't measured in money or fame. It was measured in the devastating loss of blood ties that could never be repaired. In 1994, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis passed away in her Fifth Avenue apartment from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. When Jackie's 35-page will was made public in a New York court, it contained one final strike against Lee. Jackie left an estate worth hundreds of millions of dollars along with priceless properties to her two children, John Jr. and Caroline, as well as to various charities and friends. But for Lee, Jackie included a freezing stipulation. The will stated she was making no provision for her sister Lee B. Radziwill, whom she held in great affection, because she had already done so during her lifetime. Those words were broadcast across global newspapers. Even as she crossed over into death, Jackie ensured she kept her position as the golden child who held the power. She pushed Lee into the role of a dependent, a younger sister living off her siblings' generosity. A reconciliation between the two sisters never happened. But the greatest tragedy of Lee's life was still waiting for her. Lee's only son, Anthony Radziwill, born in 1959, was the absolute pride and joy of her life. Anthony was a talented television producer known for being humble and warm. In the early 1990s, he was diagnosed with a rare and brutal form of cancer. Throughout Anthony's painful years of treatment, his best friend and the cousin who stood by his hospital bed like a devoted brother was John F. Kennedy Jr., Jackie's son. The two children of the rival sisters had found a pure friendship in one another, rising entirely above the jealousy of the previous generation. Then in the summer of 1999, tragedy struck with an unimaginable cruelty. On July 16, 1999, the plane piloted by John F. Kennedy Jr. crashed into the waters off Martha's Vineyard. John died at the age of 38, along with his wife Carolyn Bessette. At the time, Anthony Radziwill was on his deathbed in the final stages of cancer. He had to receive the news that his best friend, his only true brother, was gone. Just 25 days later, on August 10, 1999, Anthony Radziwill passed away at the age of 40. In less than a month, Lee Radziwill lost her only son, whom she loved more than life itself, and she lost her nephew, the last living reflection of Jackie, the young man who had sat counting her son's fading heartbeats. At Anthony's funeral in East Hampton, Lee appeared in black. Her face displayed a terrifyingly absolute composure. She did not collapse in tears. She refused to perform her grief for the media cameras. It was the ultimate endurance of a woman who had been taught since she was 4 years old that public emotion was a failure. In her final years, Lee split her time between Paris and her New York apartment. In her last major interview with the New York Times T magazine, sitting in her living room overlooking East 72nd Street, the interviewer intentionally brought up Jackie. Lee looked straight at the camera and said she would have to be made of stone not to have moments of jealousy regarding Jackie. She acknowledged her sister had everything, but she insisted she did not hold on to envy. She said, "People always thought of them as attached at the hip, and while she had an exceptional life, it was balanced out by tragedy." It was the most honest confession from an 80-year-old woman. She acknowledged the wound, but she refused to let it define her final days. No one wins a race created by the family. On February 15, 2019, Caroline Lee Bouvier Radziwill took her last breath in her New York apartment. She was 85 years old. The next morning, obituaries appeared across major publications from the New York Times and the Washington Post to Le Figaro. And the first line of almost every single article read the same way. Lee Radziwill, the younger sister of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, has died. Until the very last moment, the world remembered Lee by the label she had spent 80 years trying to tear away. Looking back at the nearly century-long chain of events involving the Bouvier sisters, a harsh truth emerges. Jacqueline and Lee were not the villains of their own stories. They were victims of a deeply flawed high society mindset built by their parents. Black Jack Bouvier, with his public favoritism and his game of vitamin P, planted the idea that love was a limited resource meant to be fought over. Janet Bouvier, with her pragmatic philosophy treating marriage as a tool for status, taught her daughters that a woman's value lay in securing a powerful man and maintaining a flawless public image. The sisters executed that blueprint perfectly. They conquered the highest peaks of power titles, fashion, and global attention. Jackie became the First Lady of the United States, the ultimate American widow, and the queen of a shipping tycoon. Lee became an exiled Polish princess, an international fashion icon, and a curator of classic beauty. But to make that blueprint work, they paid with their most priceless assets. They sacrificed their sisterhood and their inner peace. They spent their youth looking in the next lane to see how many steps ahead the other was running. They chose husbands, lovers, and friends based on the impact it would have on the other. They even wrote their wills as final strategic moves. As a result, both finished their journeys completely alone at the top. Jackie passed away, leaving behind a family fracture that could never be healed. Lee passed away only after watching everyone she loved die before her, leaving a legacy forever overshadowed by her sister's silhouette. Lee's apartment on East 72nd Street was put up for sale after her death for $16.9 million. The new owners would inherit the dark paneled rooms, the exquisite yellow chairs, and spaces bathed in sunlight. But they would never find Lee's essence. That unique atmosphere was created by a woman who spent her entire life extracting elegance out of the most private pain. The story of Jacqueline and Lee Radziwill is not a fairy tale about old money, nor is it cheap tabloid gossip about female jealousy. It is a historical warning about the cost of living your life measured by someone else's ruler. When a family turns love into a competition, it doesn't matter if the prizes are crowns, titles, or hundreds of millions of dollars. The one who crosses the finish line first and the one who comes in second both end up with the exact same reward: total emptiness.